Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our briefing this morning. We'll give people a few moments just as they are logging in, but a very warm welcome. My name is Nigel Sydenham. I'm part of the trainer faculty here at CCL Academy, and I'm here with my colleague, Martin Mitchell. We're going to be taking you through the briefing this morning. We've got quite a good number of people joining. We'll just give them, as I say, a moment or two. Just as that's happening, just a word or two by way of introduction. Firstly, in terms of logistics, those of you that have been on one of these sessions before will know there's the Q&A function. So please, at any point in proceedings, if you've got a question that comes up, something you'd like us to explore a little more, please do use that. We're going to try to get through as many of the questions as we possibly can towards the end of the session, but please do use that just to capture those questions. Secondly, in terms of our topic this morning, what is the FCA expecting of your conduct training? Some of you will know this is one of a series of sessions that we have been delivering as briefings for clients on a range of topics, but including a series on the SM&CR. And we just felt it was topical with many of our clients at the position of either planning or implementing their conduct training, just to be setting out what the FCA has been saying on this topic. So hopefully a useful session over the next 30 minutes or just under that. Again, just giving people another moment, keep seeing people coming into the briefing, and then we'll get underway. Okay. I'm sure we'll have some more people joining us, but I'm very mindful of time and of our time constraints. So very good morning, as I say, and welcome to our briefing. Let's make a start. In terms of our agenda, three key things that we're going to try to cover over the time that we've got this morning. I'm going to take you through the first section, looking at just a little bit of context and diving into the specific FCA guidance. The FCA has become increasingly clear on its expectations around conduct training. And so we're going to outline those for you. I'm then going to hand over to my colleague Martin, who's going to take us through just some examples of some of the techniques we've been using at CCL to really deliver effective conduct training. This is something we've been working on with clients ever since the implementation of the regime for banks. So it is something we have been doing over a number of years now, and hopefully able to give you some insights. And then finishing off with some key takeaways, key messages that we think you should be considering as you're either implementing, planning, reviewing your conduct training, wherever you are positioned on that. So that's the plan for the session. Before we go any further, a quick question, just to capture the sense in the room, get a bit of a snapshot of where everyone is on this subject. How confident are you that your firm's conduct training or planned training, if you're not yet delivering that, is effective and meets all of the FCA's expectations? Now, I can promise you this is confidential, it is anonymous, the response, but it would be great if we can have the poll in front of us now, just to give people a chance to respond. As I say, it is anonymous, we're not going to hold anyone to this, but it would just be great to get a sense, a snapshot around the room, the virtual room anyway, of where people are and how they are feeling. So we'll give you a moment or two, please, to respond. It would be great to get responses from as many of you as possible. Give you another few seconds. And then if we can display the results, that would be great. Okay, really interesting. And it's always nice to just to get a feel for where people are. Got a few very fortunate people feeling very confident. Bulk of you, probably nearly 3/4 saying they're reasonably confident. With just one or two of you not so confident at all. Okay, if we can close that. As I said, I'm going to start off just by looking at a little bit of context and also spelling out for us what the FCA is saying about its expectations. And some of you will know, when the FCA announced the extension of the deadline for SM&CR implementation for solo regulated firms, in other words, when it announced that rather than December, it would be pushing that date back to March. Part of that announcement, but it made some specific comments around conduct training. Firstly, that senior managers must ensure conduct rules training is effective. This very first key point, I think, just recognize that conduct training is not just a sort of add-on or a little sort of administrative piece. We're increasingly seeing from the FCA that, yes, of course, senior management component is really important, certification is important, but this conduct piece, again, is another key plank in this package of measures. It went on to say these programs will need planning, time and effort to deliver effectively. And that's something that, as I've said, we've been working with clients in different contexts, different size of firms, different types of firms for several years now. And I absolutely attest to this. It can be done, but it does take time, it takes thought, it takes effort to deliver effectively. Let's briefly, and I appreciate for most of you this is a reminder, but let's just, for context, let's just briefly remind ourselves of actually the rule book on this. So the FCA handbook in COCON says, the obligation on the firm, if you're covered by the SM&CR, is to ensure that all of your employees who are subject to the rules are notified of those rules, and secondly, understand how those rules apply to them. Goes on to say that's going to include suitable training, but that last paragraph in particular, that all staff who are subject to the rules should have an awareness, a broad understanding of all of the rules. So everyone should know something about all of the rules, but they should also have a deeper understanding of the practical application of the specific rules which are relevant to their work. And the handbook goes on to give a couple of specific examples of guidance. If you're thinking about, well, what does that look like? If your firm, for example, has people who are involved in any way in trading in the markets, then Rule 5, which most of you all know is about market conduct, that obviously has a particular application for those individuals if they're trading, if they're instructing traders, and you'll need to think, okay, are we giving them training on the application of that rule? You know, what does that look like? What are we expecting of them? Secondly, for firms who have individuals who deal directly with customers, which I'm careful about saying every firm, but I'm assuming almost every firm, if not every, will have that type of role. If you have people who are dealing directly with customers, then again, Rule 4, that you take account of customers' interests, you treat them fairly, thinking through what's the practical application of that rule, not just that they know the rule, but what does that look like in the context of your firm or their particular role? Okay, so that's the rules. And again, many of you will have seen that in the handbook or will have mentioned it on one of our previous sessions. Let's come then to the FCA's expectations. And our starting point, the FCA stock take report. So this was published last summer, and it was the FCA looking at how the regime had been implemented in the banking sector. A number of really interesting takeaways from that more generally, if you are either reviewing your implementation or you're actually in the process of implementing the regime. But for our purposes, particularly the references to conduct rules. Staff generally understood the rules, was the FCA's finding. However, firms have not always sufficiently tailored their conduct rules training to staff's job roles. Now, that was part of the reason for showing you the rule. Just to be clear, we all know that then that this is an obligation. The finding from the FCA was that firms were finding that difficult. And as I say, from our experience, I think at CCL Academy, we would say we absolutely understand this. And it's simply because it's not easy. Think about your own firm. Think about all of the range of roles that are performed by people who are subject to the conduct rules. Everything from front office staff through to operational roles, through to marketing, compliance, risk type roles, right across that spectrum. And now think about, okay, how would we tailor our training to the type of firm we are and to the type of role that people are doing? That's not straightforward. And so it's perhaps unsurprising that firms were finding that to be a challenge. The other point, just picking up on the bottom of the slide there, and this is something that I perhaps was slightly surprised to find, but have found repeatedly, working in session after session on this with clients, many firms unable to explain what a conduct breach looked like in the context of their business. And what I found across multiple sessions is that even though people can, well, they know the rules and they can look at a scenario or a case study, if we then ask them the question, what does this look like in your context? How could someone in your team, how could someone sitting, okay, virtually today, but probably, but on your left or on your right, you may not be sitting in an office anymore, but your colleagues all around you in your team, what could one of them do to breach the conduct rules? And for many people, in my experience, that's quite a challenging question. I spoke to a client a little while ago who was worried about what he referred to as a failure of imagination on the part of some of his employees. The difficulty of just seeing, okay, this is how this could go wrong here. And so just an interesting point to consider. The FCA mentioned that when it extended the deadline, that it would be putting out some more information on its expectations, and it went ahead and did that. This is all on the FCA's website, but a really useful set of negative and positive indicators. As I've said, this is all on the FCA's website, so I'm not going to go through it line by line. I just want to highlight one or two points just quickly. First one, and perhaps one of the major challenges, only giving obvious examples of breaches. One or two of my colleagues have seen particularly egregious examples of this. Some very simplistic scenarios. Look, if you're asking people if insider dealing is wrong, I'm not sure that's really adding a lot of value. So something which really draws out the nuances is going to be important. Coming down to the bottom, actually putting it in the context of the overall regime. As I've said, there can be a slight tendency just to see this as an exercise we need to do, but the FCA is very clear. This is one of the pieces of the jigsaw. This is about cultural change, and so actually seeing it in the context of the overall regime, of its overall objectives, I think is really important. The last point there, saying, well, it's nothing new. This is just what we do already. One last point. It's really interesting to me. This is one of the first times we've seen the FCA be quite specific about training methods. Notice what it's saying, that simplistic forms of e-learning or online learning potentially are just not going to be effective. Why? Well, because it falls on that hurdle of tailoring to the role. Positive indicators, obviously many of these are fairly self-explanatory in lots of ways because they're the opposite of what we've just seen. But for example, training needs to be interactive and use realistic scenarios. Back to our point about online learning. Can you use online learning? Yes, absolutely. But again, remember the expectation that it's going to be interactive, that it's going to use realistic scenarios. They're going to be tailored. And scenarios which draw out the nuances of how the rules apply in different contexts. As we've said, putting it in the context of the overall regime is important, and this point about cultural change or step change. In other words, this is different. Whether you've previously been subject to rules or not, whether you were previously an approved person or not, this is a step change. This is about setting a new standard. Okay. Hopefully that's been useful just in setting out what the FCA is articulating about its expectations. As I've said, over the recent months, it's been doing that increasingly clearly. So all of this content is available on the FCA website. If you need help finding it, please just get in touch. We'd be very helpful. Very happy to direct you to the right place. I'm going to hand over at this point to my colleague Martin, who's going to pick up where we left off and also just take us forward to think about what we could be doing that actually is going to be effective in terms of delivering conduct training. So over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Nigel. That's superb. So I'm going to just change the shared screen and move it over to my screen initially. So hopefully you can now see the conduct rules, which I'm sure, given your response to the earlier question and your reasonable confidence for many of you, this is straightforward. And I'm just showing you this, the individual conduct rules, just to number one, to help me, because I'm about to launch into a couple of cases to look at how we actually tailor cases and how we might think about tailoring cases and what we've done with clients to hopefully make our training or their training more effective. And also to just highlight the generality of these things and the fact that these things are superficially simple, but the devil is very much in the detail, isn't it? What does acting with integrity mean? What would be falling foul of Rule 1 or Rule 2 or Rule 4 in terms of treating customers fairly and the like? So I hope that's helpful from that sense. Now, what I'm going to share with you is two cases. The first is called paperwork. It's one we've got hundreds of these cases now that we've developed in conjunction with clients and used ourselves, both in virtual sort of live training events and in our e-learning product lines as well. And this one is relatively recent. As I say, we've had a good degree of success when we've used it with clients in the since we pulled it together. And it's quite appropriate given where we are now, because where we are now, and I'm sure most of you attending this are sitting at home somewhere in a study, in a corner, whatever you've pieced together during this pandemic, so that you can carry on working and you can do that effectively. And this one does pick up on that kind of theme. So what we should see there, if I can get the next page down. So case study paperwork. I'll click it all up first and I'll read it through with you. So the idea is you're working at home and one of your colleagues calls you and asks if you can help with proofreading a research report. And this one is tailored on the basis of research report. Clearly, this could change, and rather than a research report, it could be some sort of internal board report or something. But the context here, tailored towards a particular research offering, is that this is an external piece of perhaps equity research. This individual mentions he's a bit nervous about this research. It's the first time he's written research on a specific company, perhaps done it on his own for the first time, and includes lots of financial data, and some of it he believes is quite sensitive. Now, you've got this on a Friday, and as happens in a normal day, whether you're working at home or anywhere else, you print out a copy, hoping to be able to sit down and review it over a cup of coffee or whatever, but you don't get to it by the end of the day, and other things take precedence. And the weekend passes, and it's now Monday, and you recall that you've got to review this report. Perhaps you've got some sort of reminder on your system. You've got to review this report, and you can't find it. And you know you printed it out, you can't find it, you're searching around your desk, and then you have a think back a little bit. And again, working at home, you do often share these resources, and other people may use your desk. And thinking back over the weekend, you remember that someone else in your household, as you see, we could be partner, could be spouse, could be housemate, could be child or whatever, used your desk on the weekend, and you recall that, shockingly, they gathered their things together and they took some stuff out to the recycling bin. And unfortunately, you also remember that Monday is when your recycling bin disappears. And you remember as you were waking up in the morning, you heard them crashing around outside your home and off the recycling went. So it is no longer an option for you to go out there and dive around and see whether it was put in the recycling by mistake, in error, by your loved one or housemate, as may be the case. So the big question is, what would you do? We'll touch upon that in a moment, but have you breached the conduct rules is the key point. And there is the poll in front of you. So what do you think? Do you think you've breached any of the conduct rules? It's just a simple yes or no. So away you go. Now, hopefully we've got a few in there, so perhaps we could close that and share the results. So where are we? 83% of you are saying yes, you have breached the rules. 17% of you are saying no, you haven't breached the rules. Now, I presume, my guesstimate is that the particular rule you believe has been breached is probably individual conduct rule 2, which is due skill, care and diligence in terms of keeping this stuff safe, making sure it doesn't get lost, making sure it's unlikely to end up in inappropriate hands. And that seems to be the issue. I presume some of you could have thought it might be a bit more than that. I mean, it could be the interests of customers. It could be individual conduct rule 4 that's also hit by this one, because this research with its sensitivity could get out into the wrong hands ahead of others, and that may not be appropriate to some of your customers who should all be seeing this at the same point. Yeah. So I tend to agree. I tend to agree this is a breach, and it probably is 2 and potentially 4 in terms of the conduct rules that are breached. Now, in terms of what would you do, what could you do, what would most people do in this sort of circumstance, and in live events, this is very much the benefit that this kind of case can have, and this one has certainly opened up a lot of discussion about what should be done. My own view is that ultimately these things are all about coming clean, and saying, look, this is what I've done to the appropriate escalation or whatever. This one, there are some question marks about the nature of the sensitivity. Obviously, if this is external research, presumably most of what's in it is publicly available information, and the sensitivity would presumably depend on the conclusions that are being reached in the research, and whether that's different to the conclusions you've reached before. So it could be someone that recommended this company as a buy for a long time, and suddenly they're now recommending it's a sale. So that might make it more sensitive, for example. If we move away from it being a research report and it were a board report or whatever, then clearly there could be much more sensitivity about that, and perhaps the escalation through to compliance, through to your management, to work out how you deal with this might be much more appropriate, and much more of a demand on you. So what would you do? There are some obvious things that you would do as well. You'd reassess the sensitivity, wouldn't you? And say, well, my God, if that did get into the wrong hands, how much impact is it likely to have? And that will give you some sort of status of how much you've got to shout and scream and act on this one. So that's the paperwork case. I think that's a good example of one that has, as the FCA has been looking for, the nuance, the discussion points, the transferability to it as well, that clearly most of us have been involved in something like this, I would imagine, in our lives, or we could at least imagine being in exactly this circumstance. And the research report, as I say, could be some sort of board paper, and there are very much reputational issues about this, as well as sensitivity issues. It's just embarrassing if something gets out before the intended release date by somewhere. I can't imagine people going through your recycling, but it could happen, couldn't it? So that's paperwork. I hope that was a useful one. Now, moving on. Non-financial misconduct. Now, I'm trying to tee up the second case here, and the second case, as you can imagine by this heading, is going to relate to non-financial misconduct. And here, a couple of quotes from different personalities within the FCA, which are just saying, look, this is a big issue these days. It's an emerging issue. It's an issue that's really sensitive. It's really rather important now with the whole Harvey Weinstein, the Me Too movement, with the whole Black Lives Matter thing and everything else. This stuff is important, can have a huge bearing on reputational issues, and can make a big difference. And clearly the FCA recognizes that and is making that absolutely clear. Misconduct is misconduct, whether it's financial or non-financial, says Megan Butler, for example. So clearly this does matter. Now, we've done lots of cases on this too, and again, I'd like to share another one with you. This one is about a staff appraisal, and it's highlighting the sensitivity of personal feelings versus perhaps corporate pressures in terms of an appraisal situation. So here we go. Staff appraisal, it's called. It presumes you're conducting a staff appraisal. The individual being appraised reveals that it doesn't have to be a he, it should be a she, I guess, has got himself into significant amounts of debt through gambling. Now, you decide, for whatever reason, it's best not to record that fact. And the reason justifying your non-recording is this is because you like the individual concerned, and maybe crucial to you, perhaps, you feel he's doing his best to work through the problem, and you don't feel that perhaps escalating it and sharing it is the right thing to do. Now, have you breached the conduct rules? So again, if we could share the poll on that one, please vote away, and I'll give you a few seconds to do that. It's quite a simple one. So hopefully we've got plenty of responses there. So perhaps we could close that and share the screen, share the results, I'm sorry. Yeah, so 82% of you saying yes, still a significant minority saying no. This is a tricky one. It does have nuance. It does promote discussion and investigation, and that's got to be a healthy thing in terms of training events. But I would very much go with the majority here. I mean, it is, despite your sensitivity and your kind of personal relationship, you've got to sort of divorce that from your business responsibilities, if you like. It's not for you to choose what does go into an appraisal and what doesn't. If this individual is dealing with perhaps the business's money, perhaps customers, funds, customers' assets, then obviously this is hugely important that this individual is also potentially in debt and potentially moving towards desperation to solve his problem. So very much this is a conduct issue, and this should very much be shared and not be hidden away. So by hiding it away, you are doing the wrong thing, should we say. So there's a couple of cases, both of which have been very useful for us during events. We've got, as I say, hundreds more that we tailor, and you saw some examples of the tailoring in that research one, for example. There's plenty of scope to tailor that to particular job roles. And I must admit, we do that both in live events and in our e-learning events. I spent a big chunk of yesterday afternoon actually playing around with the wording of a case that's going to sit with a particular client on their e-learning, which is trying to bring out one of the conduct rules, and the client was trying to make it specific and relevant to the firm, but the client's attempts at that were a little bit clumsy, and I've had to play around with that, and hopefully together we are reaching the end result, which is success on both sides. So let's move on a little bit, and let's begin to look at our key takeaways. So what you've seen, what can you learn? What should you take away? I'll click it all up again and I'll talk it through. So this is very much drawing on those negatives and positives. Questions for you to consider, for you to think about. Did you do this? Are you doing this? Can you make sure you're capturing this within your training? This, as I say, it's drawing from the FCA's negatives and positives. So how will you ensure your training is interactive and utilizes realistic scenarios? They do need nuance, they do need care, they do need building. I would suggest, obviously, we can help with that kind of thing, but certainly sharing it with your colleagues and thinking about these things is clearly important. How will you ensure you're tailoring to particular roles? Well, again, it's granularity, I think, and it's thinking about teams in the smaller sense as well as the broader sense. So you can think about what the total business does, and then you can think about smaller groups and maybe doing specials for those smaller groups that begins to tailor to their particular needs and make these things real for them. What role, if any, will e-learning play, and how will you ensure training is put into context? So the first part of the fourth point and the third point, I'm going to try and link up a little bit. I think e-learning is really useful to put this stuff into context. It doesn't have to be used for that, but if you've got lots of people, it works very well in that sense. To begin to make it interactive, realistic, and tailored is somewhat more demanding and requires somewhat more care and investment. I think we do that rather effectively, but it does require more care and effective. Generally, e-learning is good for context. The regime presented as a step change in expectations, well, I must admit, over the years, I've played quite a lot on Fred the Shred and Fred Goodwin to do that, because the fact that he kind of, whether you call it getting away with it or not, but he's not in jail, is he? And he's not suffering great hardship from a monetary sense. I mean, sure, his reputation is shot and he might have grown a beard, but many of us have over this period. But the fact that he largely got away with what he managed to do at Royal Bank of Scotland is enough for me to say, look, this is trying to stop that happening again, really does say this is a step change and really does begin to make that absolutely clear to people. I find that helpful anyway. The final point touches upon something Nigel said a while ago about what conduct breaches look like in the context of people's own roles. And we've had a lot of success. Sometimes they lack imagination, as Nigel says, but we've had a lot of success by posing that question to groups that we train. So asking of those attendees at a course what they think might form a breach in the context of their own roles can be very useful, and sharing those amongst what I described a few moments ago is a more granular team of perhaps, I don't know, between 5 and 15 people or whatever. Yeah. So I think that works very effectively as well. Now, those are our key takeaways. Q&A. Now, we haven't really said this, and perhaps I should bring it in now, but there is a number of you know that with Zoom, you've come across Zoom quite a lot, you've got the ability to explore the chat, and you've got also with Zoom webinars, which this is being delivered over, you've got this Q&A function. Now, if any of you have particular questions, please feel free to jot them down in the Q&A. I'll have a look and see whether there's anything's there at the moment. And myself and Nigel will endeavour to hopefully answer that for you. So we've got one on the paperwork case. Is this something that a firm should be reporting to the FCA? And I'm going to have a go at answering that live. Obviously, it very much depends on the sensitivity. Nigel can come in on this one as well. Potentially, I think the answer to that is yes, but it depends on what you assume. But Nigel.
All I was going to add to that is there's a couple of things. I mean, obviously, one of the things we will talk about it with groups is the implications of these judgments. So if you do think it's a conduct rule breach, then it will be reported as part of your routine reporting of conduct rule breaches. It will also be reported on references, regulatory references. And so that's one of the ways that we draw in the whole regime into these sorts of conversations. So that individual, if they've breached the conduct rules, if they then go on to apply for another role in another firm, that will be recorded as part of the regulatory reference. And so we start to see the impact of these sort of changes. In terms of whether you specifically need to refer this to the FCA, other than as a conduct rule breach, that will depend on whether, in your view, it's something the regulator would expect to hear about. Now, of course, if in an extreme scenario, if that was a disclosure of inside information, that might well tip the balance towards saying, yes, it absolutely would. If it was something that's far more marginal, you might say, well, actually, we wouldn't assess that as something that the regulator would expect to hear about. So again, that is about a judgment call, but it does, to at least some degree, hinge on, if you consider that the individual's breached the conduct rules, then at very least it will be reported as part of your routine conduct rule breach reporting obligations. Yeah, no, it was a great question.
Brilliant. I've got another couple of goodies here. So we've got one asking about how we demonstrate to the regulators that we've carried out effective conduct rules training. What kind of things would the regulators want to see? Again, it's a judgment call, and I would say something like an e-learning module is quite useful in this sense, because you've potentially got assessments that are marked and you've got records of that. Nigel, you're thinking you want to add something to that?
I think one of the things that is always a challenge here is thinking about how could you demonstrate that your conduct rules training is effective. In reality, of course, it's effective if it makes a difference, and that's very difficult to measure. But I think certainly, some form of consideration given to that, and whether that is at very least an assessment, you may actually simply recorded as part of that they attended, and that there was, you also have a record of the types of discussions that took place. Again, I think there is an element of saying, okay, what we can evidence is that we raised these issues, there were realistic scenarios, we discussed them and the nuances around them. It's very difficult to definitively and objectively prove this training was effective because it made a difference to people's behavior. But actually being able to demonstrate that you met the regulator's expectations, I think that's a more manageable task. So yeah, I think that is doable.
We've got a couple of questions around the gambling case study. One of them is talking about if it wasn't in an appraisal situation. In fact, they're both saying that if it wasn't an appraisal situation and someone confided in you, would that be a conduct breach? Potentially, I think so. Yes. I mean, you can not know what you do know. It's very difficult. You've got to put yourself in a position to say, look, if this person ended up stealing lots of customer funds or whatever, and you knew they had a gambling problem and you chose to keep it to yourself, then potentially that is a breach, absolutely. We've got another one here regarding the paperwork case. If you're writing corporate sponsored research, should you inform the issuer, read the breach? Potentially, absolutely. So what would you do? What should you do? Potentially, if you've lost something and you're truly worried about it and the sensitivity surrounding it, then potentially you should do exactly that. Yeah. Nigel, you wanted to add something to that, I think?
No, that's fine. I was just trying to, that's fine.
Okay.
That's
okay. Fine. I think we've answered most of the questions there. Let me just have a quick look at. There was one I wanted to. No, I think we're there. On the gambling case, would this be noted if the person is in a role that has no linkages to clients, company funds, assets? Well, I think so. Yeah. I mean, if someone's got a serious gambling problem, then even if they haven't got the linkage to the clients, which would make it even more pressing, I think there is this temptation to do things more fraudulently, potentially, just these general behavioral things that could be different if someone is suffering those kind of pressures. And I think it's right for them that you perhaps can help them through that problem in a way that's logical. So yeah. I do think you should note it regardless. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all of the questions that we've had come in. Just before we close, we do want to give you an opportunity. Some of you will already be on our mailing list for updates and other materials. We do want to give you an opportunity just to sign up if you're not already. So there will be a question just coming up now in front of you, just to confirm. If you're not already and you'd like to receive regulatory updates and other materials from us, do please let us know about that. You can just make your selection there. Obviously, if you've got questions, if you've got other issues that you want to raise with us, please do feel free to get in touch. We'd love to hear from you about any of the things that we've talked about, and we're very happy to discuss any more of those issues in a bit more detail. If we want to close the question, I think we've probably given people an opportunity to respond. That'd be great. Looks like we might have one last question. Okay. Just the last question that's come in, and we'll briefly just touch on this. So the concern here now is that if staff now know this, they may not divulge the information. And I think that is it's a really important sort of cultural point. One of the conversations, I've had some quite colourful conversations with staff around this concern about, well, is this becoming some sort of police state? Does it mean I'm having to tell tales of my colleagues, whatever? And I think it does come down to a cultural point about saying, of an open culture, and the speak up culture is increasingly the language that the FCA is using. You're absolutely right, of course. If people think that it might be passed on to the firm, then they may not divulge things. But it does seem to me that the danger otherwise is to say, we had staff who knew about this, whatever the issue is. In this case, it was gambling. But we had people who knew about this, but they didn't act. And for me, that is always the issue that is going to cause us difficulties. If we're genuinely in the position of saying, oh yes, we knew about whatever it is. We knew about that misconduct. We knew about this misbehavior or this issue, and nobody reported it, nobody escalated it. So that, I absolutely take the point. Of course, it may mean that people feel more inhibited about making those sorts of disclosures. Okay, I'm very mindful of time and that we've slightly overrun, but I do hope you think it's been a worthwhile session. I hope it's been valuable to you just in getting you to think around and explore the FCA's expectations for your conduct training. As I've said, please get in touch if there's anything else that we can help with. Martin, any final comments from you?
One comment. I absolutely agree with that cultural point, and the sensitivity, hopefully, in the corporate culture enables people to come forward and share their personal problems that may impact their work anyway, and share that in a confidential way and in an appropriate way. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that in terms of our mailing list, we do produce a quarterly newsletter that we call Concerning Conduct, and that draws out conduct issues that we found in the press, both in financial services and elsewhere, and highlights those, and in particular those non-financial conduct issues, which is potentially rather helpful. So if you'd like to get hold of that, then obviously sign up for it. You can do so at our website, even though you may have voted on the poll in a particular way. Don't worry about that. But hopefully you do feel a little bit more confident. And many of you at the start of this were on the reasonably confident level in that question. So hopefully most of you are now very confident, and those of you that were not at all confident and haven't started yet are now moving towards the reasonable confidence or beyond. But please, we are here to help in any way we can. I'm sorry we've overrun a bit. I can be a bit of a windbag. I really apologize. Yeah. So thank you so much for your time. And we're done, aren't we, Nigel? Yeah.
We are. That's everything. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.